The Aegean was restless that night. Waves slammed against rotting timber, while pirates passed jugs of wine between cracked hands. Somewhere off the coast of a forgotten island, a Cilician crew had just pulled off what they thought was the score of a lifetime. Their prize was not gold or silk. It was a man, a 25-year-old Roman aristocrat, ripped from a merchant vessel and thrown into the darkness below deck. His name was Julius Caesar. The pirates chained the hold shut and set his price at 20 talents of silver, a fortune, enough to buy freedom, land, a new life for every man aboard. They waited for the reaction they always got: begging, fury, the hollow threats of a rich man with no power. What they got instead made the laughter on deck go quiet. From the shadows beneath them came a sound no captive had ever made. Caesar was laughing. Not the desperate laugh of a man losing his mind. Something colder, something deliberate. A laugh that sat in the chest of every pirate who heard it and refused to leave. When they told him the ransom, he did not negotiate. He did not ask for mercy. He looked them dead in the face and told them they were fools. 20 talents for Julius Caesar was an insult. He demanded they raise it to 50. The crew exchanged glances. Some laughed nervously. Others reached for their blades. They figured he was either mad or too pampered to understand how easily a man disappears at sea. They mocked him above deck. They called him a fool playing noble in a cage. But something none of them could name had already shifted. With every passing hour, the captive was not shrinking into his chains. He was growing, watching every face, memorizing every name, learning every routine. He was not thinking about how to get out alive. He was already past that. He was deciding what he would do to each of them once the chains came off. These pirates believed they had caged a wealthy boy from Rome, a bargaining chip, a payday. They had no idea they had locked themselves inside a ship with the most dangerous man in the ancient world. Around 75 BC, on an unnamed stretch of open water, the Roman Republic got its first real glimpse of what Julius Caesar truly was. Not a politician, not a soldier, something else entirely. This is not a tale of a kidnapping gone wrong. This is the moment a future dictator revealed that loyalty, law, and human life were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded when they no longer served his ambition. Before we go deeper into what happened next, drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from right now. And if you have not yet, hit subscribe to support this channel. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. In the belly of that ship, time moved like tar. The hold reeked of wet timber, unwashed bodies, and sour wine soaking into the floorboards. Every swell of the sea dragged chains across wood. Men spat and cursed in broken Greek. For any ordinary captive, this would have been a waking death. But Julius Caesar was not an ordinary captive. Around 75 BC, in the foul darkness of a pirate vessel, something far stranger than a kidnapping was unfolding. A prisoner was taking command. The first sign came on the very first night. The crew above was doing what pirates do: gambling, drinking, screaming over dice. The noise hammered through the deck without pause. Any sane hostage would have buried his face and stayed invisible. Caesar did the opposite. He turned to one of his own attendants, a man seized alongside him, and gave a simple instruction. "Go up. Tell them to shut their mouths. I need to sleep." No hesitation. No fear in the voice. Just a flat Roman order delivered as though he were back in his own household, not chained inside a floating prison in the middle of the Aegean. What happened next should have told the ancient world everything it needed to know. These men, pirates who had torched coastal villages and gutted merchant sailors without blinking, actually obeyed. There were a few sneers, a couple of muttered insults, but the roaring died down. The gambling got quieter. The ship settled into an uncomfortable silence. They were not following a captive. They were following something deeper, an authority so natural it bypassed every rational thought in their heads. Caesar closed his eyes in the dark and slept like a man in a palace. Above him, the crew had just surrendered ground they did not even know they held. Over the next 38 days, Julius Caesar did something no prisoner should have been able to do. He turned the ship into his domain. He exercised openly on deck under the sun. He demanded meals that matched his taste. He spoke to his captors the way a general speaks to foot soldiers he barely respects. When they mocked him, he laughed with them, the way a father laughs at a child who thinks he said something clever. When they got too loud, he silenced them. And the terrifying thing was not that he behaved this way. It was that they allowed it. Caesar had grasped something about human nature that most people never learn. Confidence, real confidence, the kind rooted in bone and blood and breeding, does not need a weapon. These pirates had knives and swords. They had numbers. They had every physical advantage. But they did not have what he had. They were accustomed to victims who trembled or raged or begged. They had no script for a man who acted as though the chains on his wrists were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise normal week. Then he pushed further. He began to summon them like an audience. He told them to sit and listen. At first they came out of curiosity, a few at a time. Then more showed up. Caesar recited poetry he claimed to have written. He rehearsed legal arguments crafted for Roman courtrooms. These were not casual words tossed into conversation. They were polished performances, built to move senators and judges. Now they landed on a crowd of salt-crusted criminals who could barely follow the Latin, let alone appreciate the rhetoric. When he finished, he expected praise, real, genuine admiration. When all he got were blank stares and a few muffled laughs, Caesar did not retreat. He erupted. He called them savages. He told them to their faces that they were too ignorant to recognize greatness when it stood in front of them. Picture it. A man in chains, unarmed, surrounded by killers, openly calling them stupid. Any other prisoner in the ancient world would have been gutted for a fraction of that disrespect. Caesar did it over and over again. The pirates laughed it off, but their laughter had an edge now. Something in the way he said it made the insult stick. Slowly, almost without realizing it, the crew began to orbit him. They brought him better food. They tolerated his outbursts. Some even tried to earn his approval, boasting about their raids or asking him questions about life in Rome. Caesar listened to all of it, but not because he cared, because he was studying them. He cataloged every detail. Who gave the orders? Who followed without thinking? Who hesitated before drawing a blade? Who drank the most? Who talked too much? He was building a map of every soul on that ship, and none of them knew it. At night, when oil lamps flickered against the dark water and wine made the rounds on deck, Caesar would sit among them like an old friend. The sea groaned beneath the hull. Stars burned overhead. And in that deceptive calm, he began telling them what was coming. Not his plans for Rome. Their fate. He told them plainly that once the ransom arrived and he walked free, he would return with warships. He would find every last one of them, and he would nail them to crosses along the shoreline. The first few times, they treated it as a joke. Pirates thrive on dark humor. They roared with laughter and called him consul, mocking the political title he had not yet earned. But Caesar never laughed along. He repeated the promise the next night, and the next, always in the same flat, patient tone. He described it like a man reviewing plans for a construction project, how he would track them, how they would be dragged in chains to a Roman port, how their broken bodies would hang above the tide for every passing ship to see. Some of them tried to make a game of it. They asked what kind of wood the crosses would be made from. They asked if he would let them die quickly. Caesar said no. Crucifixion in the Roman world was engineered for maximum suffering. It was reserved for slaves, traitors, and those Rome wanted to erase from memory. He wanted them to understand that in his eyes, they did not even deserve a clean death. He would not just end their lives. He would make their deaths a message carved into the coastline. The strangest part was how routine it became. A pirate would hand Caesar a piece of bread, and he would accept it with thanks before reminding the man that a cross was waiting for him. Another would crack a joke, and Caesar would laugh warmly, pat him on the shoulder, and promise his cross would be taller than the rest so he could enjoy the view on his way out. The calmer he was, the more unsettling it became. This was not anger. This was not bluster. This was a man describing the future the way someone else might describe tomorrow's weather. Every day that passed, the pirates lost a little more control without feeling it slip. The captive had stopped acting like a captive, so they stopped treating him like one. They were still armed, still dangerous, but something fundamental had shifted beneath them. They had become characters in a story Caesar was already writing. Their discipline softened. They drank more freely. They argued more openly. They bragged louder about past crimes, never once considering that the man sitting quietly among them was filing away every word for future use. Because none of this was personal. Not really. Caesar wanted revenge, yes, but more than that, he understood what this moment could become. He was a young Roman clawing his way upward in a republic that worshipped bold action and public spectacle. If he simply survived this kidnapping, the story would fade into nothing. But if he survived and then returned with fire and iron, if he turned his own humiliation into a display of unstoppable force, every powerful man in Rome would hear his name. These pirates were not just enemies. They were raw material for a legend. Quick pause. If you are still here, if this is the kind of history that grips you and refuses to let go, you are exactly who this channel was built for. We have a private circle called The Lineage, our channel membership. It is not just support. It is a statement. It says, I want to go deeper. I want the stories no one else is telling. Members keep this channel alive and get early access to everything before the rest of the world sees it. If that sounds like where you belong, consider joining The Lineage. Now back to Caesar and the men who had no idea their deaths were already decided. While Caesar played his role aboard the ship, a different kind of war was being fought on land. 50 talents of silver was not a sum you pulled from a drawer. It was staggering. His allies, his political contacts, his family connections, all of them had to move fast. Favors were called in. Moneylenders were pressured. Relatives were squeezed. 50 talents was the weight of dozens of men cast in solid silver. Paying it was not an act of generosity. It was a declaration that this one young aristocrat was worth bending the entire financial machinery of Rome. Day after day on the ship, the pirates scanned the horizon and waited. They had done this dance before. Grab a wealthy Roman, name a price, collect, vanish. The formula had never failed them. They had no reason to believe this time would break the pattern. Meanwhile, below and among them, Caesar watched and waited with a patience that bordered on predatory. Nothing in the ancient sources suggests he ever doubted for a second that the money would come. He behaved as though his release was not a hope, but a certainty. Just the next step in a sequence he had already mapped from beginning to end. Then the day came. Sails cut across the horizon. The empty sea that had felt like a cage suddenly filled with approaching vessels. Heavy chests were hauled aboard with grunts and swearing. Silver was counted, weighed, inspected, coin by coin. The pirates erupted with joy. One captured nobleman had just made them richer than most of them had ever dreamed. They slapped Caesar on the back. They told him they would miss his speeches. They laughed and said he should remember them when he sat in the Senate one day. The mood on deck was almost warm, almost friendly, like the end of some strange shared ordeal. Caesar did not celebrate. He stood still and absorbed everything: the weight of the chests, the way the silver was divided, the faces of every man who touched the coins. He locked it all behind his eyes. Then the chains came off. For the first time in over a month, he crossed the deck without restraint. Worn planks beneath his feet, salt air filling his lungs. The faces of men he had eaten beside, laughed beside, and promised to crucify staring back at him with grins they thought were knowing. He stepped onto the vessel that would carry him to shore. Wind pressed against his face. The coastline ahead was not just freedom. It was a starting line. He did not glance back at the pirate ship with relief or gratitude. He looked back the way a man looks at a task he has already scheduled. Phase 1 was complete. Behind him, the pirates divided their fortune and believed the chapter was closed. They had their silver. They had their sea. They had their stories about the strange Roman who never once showed fear. Julius Caesar knew what they did not. The ledger was still open. Nothing had been settled. He had just been handed everything he needed: the motive, the money trail, and the perfect justification to do something no private Roman citizen was supposed to do. As his ship cut toward land, he was not thinking like a man who had just been freed. He was thinking like a predator returning to the hunt with fresh blood in the water. The pirates believed the transaction was finished. Caesar was already calculating how to reopen it with warships, crucifixion nails, and a reputation that would echo through Rome for the rest of his life. When Julius Caesar's feet hit solid ground, there was no collapse, no trembling, no moment where the weight of what he had survived caught up with him. The men at his side would later recall something unsettling. He was already talking about ships, not shelter, not rest, ships. The salt was still drying on his skin, the pirate vessel still visible on the horizon, and his mind had already leaped ahead. In his calculation, the pirates had not freed him. They had simply given him the time and space to fulfill every promise he had made in that hold. Any rational man inside the Roman system would have followed the obvious path. Report to the nearest magistrate, file a complaint, sail home to Rome and let the Senate decide what to do. A young nobleman with no military rank and no political office had no business doing anything else. That was the order of things. That was how the Republic worked. Caesar walked past all of it without a second glance. He did not turn toward Rome. He turned toward Miletus. Miletus was a thriving port on the coast of Asia Minor. It had money, ships, experienced sailors, and local power brokers who understood the sea. When Caesar arrived, he carried no title, no official command, no seal from the Senate. On parchment, he was nothing more than a private citizen nursing an insult. But Caesar had learned something aboard that pirate ship that no document could teach. If a man moves like authority, speaks like authority, and never once flinches, people will treat him as authority, whether or not anyone gave him the right. He moved through the city like a blade through cloth. He sought out ship owners, retired officers, local leaders with influence and connections. He did not present himself as a victim asking for help. He presented himself as a man with a plan and a target. He reminded everyone he spoke to that Cilician pirates were not just his personal problem. They had been bleeding Roman trade routes for years. Every merchant in Miletus had lost cargo. Every captain had lost crew. Every family along that coast had lost something to those raiders. The grievance was shared. Caesar simply made himself the point of the spear. Then came the offer that sealed it. Join him and share in everything taken. The ransom, silver, the pirate ships, whatever loot was stashed on their island. It was a clean proposition, risk for reward, but the money was only half the hook. The other half was Caesar himself. That voice, that unshakable certainty. The same force that had bent armed criminals to his will now turned on free men and pulled them into his orbit. Within days, he had assembled a small fleet and a crew willing to follow him into open water against one of the most feared pirate bands in the Aegean. None of this was legal, not even close. In the Roman Republic, raising an armed force and launching a military operation was the exclusive right of elected magistrates with formal authority. A private citizen doing what Caesar was doing could be charged with treason. He knew this. He had studied Roman law inside and out. He understood exactly which lines he was crossing and how many powerful men in Rome could use it against him later. He simply decided that none of that mattered more than what he was about to do. Ships were loaded. Weapons were distributed in the narrow alleys near the harbor. Crews ran final checks on rigging and oars. Caesar's fleet was not a proper navy. It was a sharp, improvised instrument built for one purpose: speed, surprise, total destruction. He moved among his men with the energy of someone who had been waiting for this moment since the first night in chains. There was no time for letters to Rome, no patience for bureaucratic delays. By the time any senator so much as unrolled a report about the kidnapping, the pirates would have scattered across a dozen islands. Caesar wanted them now, while they were still fat and careless with his silver. Meanwhile, off the island of Pharmacusa, the pirates drifted in a haze of celebration. They knew these waters better than anyone. Every hidden cove, every current, every escape route. If Rome responded at all, they expected it to take months, tangled in committees and debate. They had 50 talents of fresh silver to divide and spend. Their days were consumed with arguing over shares, drinking, and dreaming about what the money could buy. The strange Roman who had lectured them and promised them crosses was already becoming a punchline. A good story for the next port. A few of them might have felt something, a flicker of unease when they remembered how steady his eyes had been, how he never once raised his voice when he described their deaths, but most of them buried it under wine and laughter. He was gone. The money was real. Their ship rocked gently at anchor under familiar skies. No warships on the horizon, no signal fires on the coast. In their experience, this was the safe window after a job, when the only real threat came from rival crews, not from Rome. Back in Miletus, Caesar was gathering intelligence with surgical precision. He questioned captains, fishermen, traders, anyone who had recently sailed near those waters. He wanted exact coordinates, recent sightings, patterns of movement. He was not throwing his fleet blindly into the Aegean and hoping for the best. He was building a picture so detailed he could see the pirates in his mind before his ships ever left the harbor. The answer came back clean. They were still anchored near Pharmacusa, still close, still reachable. The speed of what followed is what separates this from every other Roman revenge story. Most men would have spent weeks planning. Caesar compressed everything into days. While the pirates were still toasting their fortune with his silver, he had already turned that silver into the fuel for their destruction. Lines were cast off. Oars broke the surface. Sails filled with wind. A fleet that no law authorized and no magistrate approved slid out of Miletus and cut across the open Aegean toward the island where his former captors still believed the story was over. Caesar did not command from the rear. He positioned himself at the front, where every man on every ship could see him. This was not vanity. It was strategy. He was constructing something larger than a raid. He was constructing a legend. Men fight harder when they believe in the person leading them, and belief is built by proximity to danger. As the port disappeared behind them, the sailors on those decks were not following a title or a rank. They were following a will so fierce it had its own gravity. The approach to Pharmacusa was quiet. No war cries, no banners snapping in the wind. The entire plan hinged on surprise. Caesar used everything he had absorbed during his captivity. The layout of the pirate vessel. How many men crewed it. What time of day they were sharpest, and when the wine made them slow. He shaped his attack around their weaknesses. Weaknesses they had shown him freely, because they never imagined the man watching them would one day use every detail against them. As the Roman ships closed in, the pirate vessel appeared exactly where the intelligence said it would be. Anchored. Calm. Figures moved lazily on deck. No lookouts scanning the horizon. No weapons at the ready. This was not a crew prepared for war. This was a crew that believed the danger was behind them. Caesar's ships spread wide, cutting off every escape route. He did not just want to beat them. He wanted to seal them in, the same way they had once sealed him below deck. By the time the pirates understood what was happening, the trap had already closed. Roman sails appeared from multiple directions. Oars churned white water. The peaceful anchorage turned into a killing ground in seconds. Men screamed for weapons. Someone hacked at the anchor rope. Others froze, staring at the approaching hulls with the blank terror of men who had finally met something they could not outrun. The confidence that had carried them through years of raiding evaporated like mist off the sea. On Caesar's order, the boarding began. Iron hooks bit into timber. Ropes sailed across the gap between ships. Armed men poured over the rails with shields locked and blades drawn. This was not a battle between equals. It was a calculated execution disguised as combat. Some pirates fought because they had no other option. Steel rang against steel. A few of Caesar's men fell. But the outcome had been decided before the first hook was thrown. Step by step, the attackers drove the defenders backward across their own deck until there was nowhere left to stand. Caesar was in the middle of it. The ancient sources place him in the action itself, pushing forward alongside his men, shouting commands through the chaos. He recognized faces. Men who had handed him bread. Men who had laughed at his poetry. Men who had called him consul as a joke. Now he watched them crumble. There was no pause for sentiment, no hesitation born from shared meals and late-night conversations. This was the fulfillment of a contract he had drafted in his own mind 38 days earlier, and he intended to honor every clause. It ended the way ambushes always end. The pirates broke apart. Some dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. Others threw themselves into the sea. A few tried to swim for the island. Caesar's crews dragged survivors back aboard or cut them down in the water. When the noise finally stopped, the pirate ship was no longer a throne of celebration. It was a slaughterhouse. Bound prisoners sat where drunk victors had laughed hours before. Blood ran between the same planks that had once held chests of ransom silver. The silver itself was recovered. Every chest, every coin. Caesar made certain of it. The fortune the pirates had believed would change their lives was pulled from their hands and stacked under Roman guard. The men who had thought themselves rich beyond measure were now stripped of everything. Weapons gone, ship seized, bodies in chains. In the span of a single morning, their world had inverted completely. But for Caesar, capturing them was only half the promise. Killing them at sea would have been simple, quick, final, and utterly useless for his purposes. Crucifixion was not a private punishment. It was theater. Bodies nailed to wood and raised above a shoreline were meant to be witnessed by hundreds, thousands, for days. An execution carried out on the open water, seen by no one, would serve nothing. Caesar needed an audience. He needed the story to travel. He needed Rome itself to hear what he had done. With the pirates bound and the silver secured, his fleet turned back toward the mainland. The scene that greeted the port was nothing like his first arrival. He did not step ashore as a ransomed survivor. He arrived as a man who had built a navy from nothing, hunted down his captors without permission from anyone, and dragged them back in chains. People lined the docks and stared. They saw the prisoners. They saw the silver. They saw Caesar standing at the center of it all, calm and unhurried, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than collect a debt. The next move followed the shape of law, at least on the surface. Caesar brought the pirates before Marcus Junius, the Roman governor of the province of Asia. Junius held the legal authority to judge, sentence, and punish. Caesar laid his captives at the governor's feet and expected what any reasonable man would expect: a swift trial, a public execution. Crosses raised along the coast as a warning to every pirate in the eastern Mediterranean. Junius looked at the prisoners and saw something else entirely. He saw merchandise. Hardened, experienced pirates were worth serious money on the slave markets. They were strong, conditioned by years at sea, capable of brutal labor. Selling them meant profit. Clean, quiet profit that flowed directly into the governor's personal accounts without passing through the Senate's hands. Justice was expensive and produced nothing. Slavery was efficient and filled coffers. Greed wrapped itself in the governor's robes and sat down where duty should have been. When Caesar demanded the execution he had been promised, Junius pushed back. He reminded Caesar of his place, a private citizen, a man with no rank, no office, no legal authority over sentencing. The governor would handle the prisoners in his own time, by his own judgment. Caesar had done his part. He had captured them. That was more than enough. The rest belonged to proper authority. In that exchange, something cracked open. The legal machinery of the Roman Republic, the system Caesar had been raised to trust, was not interested in justice or deterrence or keeping a vow. It was interested in profit. The pirates who had terrorized Roman citizens, who had kidnapped a Roman aristocrat, who had mocked the Republic itself, were not going to hang on crosses. They were going to be marched to an auction block and sold like livestock. The promise Caesar had repeated every single night for 38 days, the oath that had calcified inside him until it became part of his identity, was about to be erased for the price of a few dozen slaves. Caesar walked out of that room, but he did not walk out defeated. He walked out with clarity. He had just seen, with perfect precision, what the system actually was. weak, corrupt, bendable by anyone with enough greed and enough distance from consequence. And he understood now that no one above him was going to deliver the sentence he believed these men deserved. If the law would not act, he would act without it. If authority failed its purpose, he would become his own authority. Before we reach the final act, one thing for those of you watching right now. The primary source that served as the backbone of this entire story is available to you through the View Products button on your screen. This is not a casual read. It is a massive, unrelenting chronicle of late Republican Rome, the kind of book that sits on a shelf for decades and rewards every return visit. If you want to go further than any video can take you, that book is where you start. And while you are in the Shop tab, look around. There is a small, carefully curated collection of themed pieces in there. Dark artifacts tied to the world of piracy, execution, and crumbling empires. No spoilers, just a quiet shelf of immersive relics waiting to be found. You will also see our official channel collection, Essential Dark History Books You Should Own, which is exactly what it sounds like. The foundation library for anyone serious about this subject. Open that tab, explore while the story continues, and turn your screen into an archive. Because as Caesar stepped away from the governor's halls and the pirates sat locked in a holding cell at Pergamon, nothing was finished. The system designed to deliver punishment had chosen profit instead. The men who had kidnapped him held a blade to his future and laughed at his vow of crucifixion were now shielded, not by mercy or law, but by one man's greed. Julius Caesar stood at a crossroads. He could accept the decision, let the system run its course, walk away with his survival and his story, and call it enough. Or he could do what he had told them he would do. He chose, without hesitation, without official sanction. He went to the prison at Pergamon, where the pirates were being held. He carried no written order, no decree from Junius, no legal document of any kind, but he carried something that mattered more in that moment than any piece of parchment. He had the loyalty of the men who had sailed with him into battle. He had the respect that came from doing what no one else in the province had the nerve to do. And he had an iron certainty that bent the world around it like heat bends air. The guards at the prison gates saw a Roman nobleman who had just delivered their coast from a plague of pirates. They saw a man who moved and spoke like he had every right to be there. And when a man like that gives orders, saying no requires a kind of courage most people simply do not have. What came next would define him. It would prove that Julius Caesar did not make threats he was unwilling to keep. It would show that the distance between citizen and tyrant, between justice and vengeance, was nothing more than a decision made in a single moment. And it would send a message that traveled from the prison walls of Pergamon all the way to the marble halls of Rome. A message about what happens when one man decides that his will matters more than every law, every institution, and every life standing in his way. The prison at Pergamon was designed for men who still believed the law had power over them. The pirates crammed inside those walls did not share that belief. They had spent their adult lives answering to nothing but wind, blade, and their own appetites. Iron bit into their wrists now, yes, but many of them felt something close to relief. They had escaped death at sea. The governor seemed inclined to sell them rather than kill them. Slavery was miserable, but it was breathing. They could survive chains. They had survived worse. What they did not know was that Julius Caesar was already on his way back. He arrived at the prison not as a petitioner and not as a man seeking permission. He came flanked by armed men, the same crew who had sailed with him to Pharmacusa and helped him tear the pirates from their own deck. To the guards standing at the gate, this was the Roman who had done in days what the provincial government had failed to do in years. He had cleared their waters of a menace the governor had been content to ignore. That kind of action carried a gravity that no official title could match. Caesar demanded the prisoners be turned over to him. Whether he used persuasion, intimidation, silver, or simply the crushing weight of his presence, the historical record does not say. But the outcome is clear. The guards complied. Locks were opened. Chains were checked. One by one, the pirates were dragged from their cells and assembled in a line, blinking and furious. They had expected to be marched to an auction block eventually, not hauled out under armed guard with no explanation and no warning. By now, fragments of news had filtered into the prison. They had heard that Caesar fought with the governor over their sentence. They had heard he wanted blood, not profit. Some of them thought back to those nights on the ship, those calm, measured descriptions of crosses and coastline. The laughter that had always followed those threats suddenly felt hollow. The name Caesar, which had been a joke during captivity, now pressed against their chests like a stone. They were marched out of the city. Pergamon's walls shrank behind them. Dust kicked up under shuffling feet. The column of bound prisoners, flanked by armed Romans, moved along the road in full view of anyone passing. People stopped and stared. They saw weathered, scarred men with the look of the sea still burned into their skin, the kind of figures who had haunted these coasts like a recurring nightmare. Now they walked in chains. Some onlookers likely assumed the governor had finally ordered an execution. Others probably guessed a public slave auction. Caesar had chosen the location with the precision of a stage director. He selected ground outside the city where the earth rose, and the road curved close, a spot impossible to miss. Open, elevated, exposed to every traveler and every pair of eyes within a mile. Timber had already been delivered. Local laborers, working under his instructions, had cut and dragged heavy beams to the site. The wood lay flat on the ground, raw and unfinished, waiting to be assembled. Before a single pirate understood what was unfolding, the landscape itself told the story. This was not a holding area. This was where men were going to die. The prisoners saw the beams and the tools spread across the dirt, and understanding hit them like a wave. Crucifixion was not abstract to these men. They had seen it before. Bodies mounted along Roman roads and harbor approaches, left to rot as public announcements of what the empire did to those it wanted erased. It was a punishment engineered for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. The lowest death Rome could invent. And now the raw materials for that death were being assembled in front of their eyes. Some of them started begging. Others shouted, trying to negotiate. A few reached back to the weeks on the ship, grasping at any thread of connection. They had shared meals with this man. They had laughed together. They had listened to his speeches and clapped when he asked them to. They had been told, in his lighter moments, that they amused him. Now they tried to spin those scraps into a shield. You said you liked us. We treated you fairly. You owe us something for that. Caesar heard all of it. His expression did not change. To him, this scene was not a surprise or a moral crisis. It was the final page of a plan he had been writing since the first night they locked him in that hold. He had told them exactly what would happen. He had named the punishment. He had described the method. He had repeated it so many times that the words had worn grooves into the air between them. The fact that he was now standing over them, free and armed, while workers hammered crossbeams into shape behind him, was not a twist in the story. It was the ending he had promised from the beginning. The construction crew worked without pause. Long vertical beams were laid out. Cross pieces were measured and fastened. Holes were dug into the rising ground where the assembled frames would stand upright. Rope and iron nails were arranged nearby. Crucifixion was not a complicated mechanism. It was brutally simple. Every element served one function: hold a human body suspended above the earth, unable to escape weight or agony, visible to every person who passed. Caesar did not stand at a distance. He supervised the work directly. He positioned the crosses in a deliberate line, spaced so that no single body would be hidden by another. Anyone approaching from the road would see not one execution, but a full row. An entire pirate crew mounted together in sequence. This was not just punishment. It was architecture. A structure built to carry a message across the region and eventually across the Republic itself. One man, acting alone, without rank or legal authority, had hunted his enemies to the edge of the world and displayed them for all to witness. Then came the detail that still stops people when they hear it for the first time. The ancient sources record that Caesar ordered his men to cut the pirates' throats before raising them onto the crosses. On the surface, this looks like compassion, and in the narrowest possible sense, it was. Crucifixion was designed to kill slowly. The body hung until it could no longer draw breath. It could last hours, sometimes days, consciousness fading and returning, muscles failing one by one. By slitting their throats first, Caesar spared them that prolonged destruction. But listen carefully to how he justified it. He did not say they deserved mercy. He did not say he felt pity. He said they had entertained him because they had been amusing company, because they had played along with his jokes and sat through his speeches and made the weeks of captivity more tolerable. He would grant them this single concession. It was not kindness. It was a reward dispensed at his discretion, like a wealthy patron deciding which performer earned a coin at the end of the evening. That is where the true horror lives. Caesar had seized total control, not just over whether these men lived or died, but over the texture of their dying. He had overridden the governor's authority. He had stepped completely outside the legal process. He had imposed his own sentence on his own timeline. And even within that sentence, he reserved the right to calibrate their suffering according to his personal sense of what they had earned. Their final moments did not belong to them. Their final moments belonged to him. Imagine it from the perspective of one man, a pirate who had once passed Caesar a cup of wine on a quiet night at sea, who had listened to his poetry and shrugged, who had called him consul and laughed. Now that man stood bound to rough timber. A Roman soldier stepped forward with a blade. Caesar's word hung in the salt air like a verdict already carved in stone. The cut was fast. No trial, no appeal, no formal proceeding of any kind. The promise made on the rolling deck of a ship in the Aegean was fulfilled in a single irreversible sequence: capture, chains, cross. One after another, the men who had once mocked the idea of dying at their captive's hand were silenced. Their bodies were fixed to the crosses and raised into position. The throat-cutting meant their suffering was brief, but the visual impact was identical. A row of figures suspended above the earth, lined up against the sky, broadcasting a single unmistakable message to every traveler, every sailor, every rival who might one day consider testing a Roman named Julius Caesar. When the last cross was planted, Caesar did not falter. There is no ancient record of remorse, no suggestion of doubt, no quiet moment of reckoning. In his mind, this was justice delivered where the official system had refused to act. More than justice, it was a declaration broadcast in wood and blood. It told every city in the province that his word was absolute. It told every competitor in Rome that he was capable of unauthorized, decisive violence in defense of his own name. It told every man who had followed him that loyalty to Caesar was rewarded, and betrayal was answered with exhibition. The governor, Marcus Junius, had been made irrelevant. He may have burned with fury. He may have felt fear. He had planned to sell those pirates for profit, and Caesar's unilateral execution had destroyed that income while exposing the greed behind it. But what could Junius do now? Arresting Caesar would mean publicly admitting that a younger man with no official standing had outmaneuvered and humiliated him. Punishing him would alienate every community along the coast that had just watched their seas cleared of a threat the governor had tolerated for years. So the crosses stood. The bodies hung as days turned, birds circled, travelers slowed their steps and stared. Sailors entering port saw the dark shapes from a distance, silhouettes against the coastal sky. Stories spread from dock to dock, from tavern to tavern, from city to city. The kidnapping, the ransom, the impossible return, the crosses, and at the center of every version of the tale, the same name, Julius Caesar. This episode did not hand him a title. It did not make him consul or dictator or commander of legions, but it accomplished something far more valuable for the trajectory of his life. It proved to him, and to everyone paying attention, that he could bend reality around his will without any formal power at all. He had assembled a fleet without authorization. He had overruled a sitting governor without holding a single public office. He had wielded violence with the appearance of state authority, while the state itself stood to one side and watched. That pattern would repeat on a scale the ancient world had never seen. In the campaigns across Gaul beginning in the late 50s BC, Caesar would again push past every boundary of what was acceptable, waging wars of staggering brutality that killed or enslaved populations so vast that ancient writers struggled to count them. Estimates from the sources speak of hundreds of thousands dead, possibly more. Modern historians debate the exact figures, but the scale is not in question. Caesar consistently transformed military decisions into personal instruments of reputation and dominance. The same instinct drove him into the political crisis that ended the Republic. In 49 BC, standing at the Rubicon River with his legions at his back, he faced the same fundamental choice he had faced outside the prison at Pergamon: obey the law and surrender his army, or cross the line and seize power by force. He crossed. Civil war consumed Rome. The republic that had shaped him, with its elections, its magistrates, its carefully constructed balance of authority, could not survive a man who had learned as a young captive that rules exist only for those willing to stop when they reach them. Seen from that distance, the pirate episode is not a colorful anecdote. It is a fracture line. Around 75 BC, Rome received its clearest possible warning of what Julius Caesar was becoming. Not merely ambitious, not merely fearless, something more dangerous. A man who treated legal boundaries and moral limits as instruments to be used when convenient and discarded when they stood in his way. A man who believed that a promise of violence was the most sacred kind of contract, and that acting without permission was always preferable to watching others obstruct his will. The cruelty of the crucifixions outside Pergamon was not chaotic. It was organized, deliberate, and staged for maximum visibility. The so-called mercy of cutting their throats first was not compassion. It was branding. It announced to the world that Caesar alone decided who died and how much they suffered, that he could override governors, that he could shatter the law and still command loyalty. It was psychological warfare aimed simultaneously at enemies, allies, and every future rival who might one day stand in his path, and the pirates themselves. In the grand sweep of the Republic's collapse, they were small, a single crew among hundreds that infested the Mediterranean. But they played a role no one else could have played. They locked Julius Caesar in a floating cell and gave him 38 days to study fear, power, and the mechanics of domination. They gave him an audience to rehearse authority on. And when they laughed at his promise to crucify them, they unknowingly volunteered to become the proof that his word was unbreakable. The first test subjects of a new principle. No one lays a hand on Julius Caesar and lives to tell the story. From that hill outside Pergamon forward, every person who crossed him walked in the shadow of those crosses. Political opponents in the Senate, tribal chieftains in Gaul, generals who underestimated his resolve. None of them could claim they had not been warned. While the Republic debated in marble chambers, a young man standing on a dusty hillside had already demonstrated what happened when law and will collided in the same man. The bodies on those crosses were not just dead pirates. They were the first cracks in a system that was already beginning to break. When Caesar was stabbed to death in 44 BC, his assassins told the world they were defending the Republic from a tyrant. But the decisive moment had passed long before their blades ever touched him. The real warning had been issued decades earlier, on a pirate ship drifting through the Aegean and on a quiet hill outside a provincial city, when a young captive laughed at the men who held him and then turned every one of them into a silent monument. The Republic watched a private citizen raise an illegal fleet and execute prisoners without trial. It should have understood, right then, that a new kind of power was taking shape inside its own walls. The pirates believed they were in control the day they pulled him off that merchant vessel. They believed they held his fate in their hands. In truth, they had stumbled into the opening act of someone else's rise. They were the first to discover that when Julius Caesar locked his gaze on you and made a promise, the only question that remained was not whether he would keep it, but how little time you had left before he did. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. If this changed the way you see Julius Caesar and the Roman Republic, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand just how dark history really gets. On your screen right now, there is another video waiting for you. Your next step down this path. Click it and keep going. If you stop here, you have only scratched the surface. That next episode is where the real descent begins. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube.